Okay, this is an audio review for Policing the National Body, Sex, Race, and Criminalization. Okay, so in American politics, we love to talk about family values, right? And by we, I mean politicians, which is, again, very ironic in the modern day, considering that Trump embodies pretty much all that's not valued in this model, meaning he's been divorced multiple times, he's an adulterer, he's bragged about sexual assault as locker room talk, all that kind of fun stuff. You know, the whole porn star thing. So often the conversation, though, when we talk about family values, and again, we being politicians, is often a sort of code about the culture of poverty, right? That kind of argument that says that the poor are poor because they have bad morals, right? So they are the problem, not structural inequalities. So never addressed are really the issues that the poor face, especially when it comes to incarceration rates and the disproportionately high assaults and searches that they receive from police. So, aggressive law enforcement policies are devastating women of color in their communities. While commonly this is voiced as an issue in communities of color in general, the majority of the women's movement took a while to acknowledge the impact of state violence as a critical concern. I mean, it's getting better, but it still has a lot of work to do. So, the reproductive rights movement, for example, has focused on protecting access to abortion, but has ignored policing, criminalization, and incarceration of many poor whites and people of color. So this also relates to cuts in welfare programs and resources that a lot of poor people, immigrants also, would have used to support themselves. So this has an impact on who can have a family and who can't. So in this, we have this narrative of choice, right? Having the right to choose, the ability to make informed choices on contraception. So this is rooted in a neoliberal ideology that treats the individual's right to their body as central to liberty or freedom. But that often obscures the social context and really the ways in which the state controls populations, how it disciplines individual bodies, and how it exerts control over gender, reproduction, sexuality, all of these things. So when it comes to state regulation and criminalization of reproduction, we tend to look at these issues through a privileged middle-class lens, especially when talking about abortion. So there are many reasons why a woman would want to terminate a pregnancy, but for poor women, especially poor women of color, these reasons are compounding and complex. So poor women and women of color are often criminalized, right? Which undermines caretaking and reproductive functions. So the author of the article suggests that to fix this, there needs to be more of a common ground between the reproductive rights movement, immigration movements, and violence against and violence against women movements. So this all has to do with that criminalization. And by coming together with these different rights organizations, they can overlap and effectively deal with some of these social issues that are largely being ignored. So also when it comes to crime and punishment in the US, the criminal justice system has become a massive machine for arrest, detention, and incarceration. So in the shadow of the war on drugs, we've seen an unprecedented over 500% increase in the number of people incarcerated in just the last 40 years. So despite this surge in incarceration rates, it's widely accepted that prisons encourage recidivism. And so again, recidivism is just the likelihood that a person released from prison ends up back in prison shortly after being released. So this shows the cyclical nature of the criminal justice system. And sadly, in a capitalistic system, there's an economic incentive to recidivism, meaning local and state revenues, jobs for correctional officers and other staff that work in jails and prisons. And now with the advent of private prison industries, this is even more blatant an economic incentive to keep people locked up, meaning there are billion-dollar industries in the bail companies that even the phone calls to prison are monetized, right? The fines and fees that you're charged after release can often compound and make it very difficult where people end up back in prison because they can't pay the fines, right? So in the, an example of this would be, there's this Democracy Now! Interview that happened about Ferguson after the uprisings there when, people were protesting basically police brutality, right? And what happened was people started looking into the revenue of the city and found that 65% of the city's revenue was coming from Black and Brown community members because they were arrested, meaning the majority of the revenue for the city was coming off of the backs of people being incarcerated. So when it comes to private prisons, these cut corners so that they can make a profit, right? So they often cut corners in staffing, in medical treatment, and even in amenities, meaning you have to buy your own toilet paper, things that are normally provided by the state. They do this so they can make a profit off the money they're getting from the state to house the prisoners. So often these private prisons also have quotas for how many people need to be incarcerated so that the local municipality will not incur fines for having empty beds. So this is very problematic, especially in the private prison industries. So prisons become very entrenched systems, kind of like the military-industrial complex. It feeds into more and more of them being built. So for example, since 1980 in California, we've built over 20 prisons and 0 universities. So, and again, don't even get me started on prison slave labor, right? So people of color are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. They're the majority of those locked up, even though their overall numbers in the population are very small. So African Americans make up roughly 13% of the population, but are about 40% of those incarcerated. So to put it another way, African Americans are incarcerated at a rate 5 times more than whites. Their sentences also happen to be about 20% longer, while Latinos are twice as likely to be incarcerated than whites, and their sentences are about 5% longer for the same crimes. So clearly there is a race bias, but there's not, just class and race. It's also gender that there's a bias in the criminal justice system. So there's a lot of gender incongruent crimes examples. So for example, poor women of color who overlap in the Venn diagram of these biases are particularly at risk for unfair treatment. So that means Black women are 8 times more likely and Latinas are 4 times more likely to be incarcerated than white women. So the criminal justice system works collaboratively with government, corporate, and professional institutions. And they do this to perform and carry out disciplinary functions that are deemed necessary to uphold the system of injustice. So the book example is the arrest of a pregnant woman for testing positive for drugs, right? Which is also, of course, biased by race and class, because who is arrested or dragged out of the hospital in chains is going to matter by race and class. Another impact of the system as it is today is militarized policing. And this is somewhat the result of the war on drugs. As a result of the money that can also be made from private contractors and military industries, our system of policing has taken a turn from community-oriented model to more of what we call military-style policing. This includes using military weapons, vehicles, and equipment that are deployed on people at home, right? Often as the result of uprising and protests of the killing of unarmed men and women of color. So there's, again, a profit motive and a connection between policing poor communities and the apparatus of enforcement groups like ICE that focus on immigrant groups. And this is even more so widespread to the fact that now this is a problem for people in schools, meaning we have this problem of what's called the school to prison pipeline. So it's no longer strange to us that in schools in poor areas are going to have metal detectors, police on campus instead of security guards, and really more of an emphasis on disciplining poor students of color through the mechanisms of the criminal justice system, instead of going to the principal's office, right? A middle-class kid, they get to go to the principal's office, they may face a suspension, while many poor kids of color are sent to the juvenile justice system for minor school infractions, like fighting. And we've all seen these viral videos of students of color being beaten, thrown out of desks, and assaulted by school security or police personnel. And now this is our new normal, which is very, very troubling. So this also relates back to, the kind of historical analysis of how these things came to be. So women of color have been the target of biological control ideologies since the founding of America. So first, the control of reproduction is really racially oppressive. So Dorothy Roberts argues that the control over reproduction is systematically deployed as a form of racial oppression, and she argues that the denial of Black reproductive autonomy serves the interests of white supremacy. Right? So this control of reproduction becomes its own white supremacist force in the culture. And California has a horrible history of this. I put a couple articles here just to give you some more information about how, up until 2010, there was lawsuits about women being forced sterilized in prison after giving birth, all of which were Latina. And so this kind of really serves in the very kind of Foucault version of the panoptical gaze, right? This causes a sense of almost internalized surveillance. It goes from the mental to the physical, right? And now with the internet and data tracking, we're even more monitored, controlled, and watched than ever before. So when it comes to the surveillance and national insecurity, right, dangers from outside the US is often what we're supposed to focus on and be worried about, right? God forbid the fact that we're dealing with white supremacist domestic terrorists that are shooting up malls and mosques and churches and all sorts of public spaces and causing panic and terrorism. The real focus that we're told to have is the outside of the US, right? Which is obviously racially conflated. So when it comes to border patrols and INS, immigration in the US has become constructed as a source of danger. So we spend billions of dollars on enforcement, on monitoring, and thanks to Trump, potentially a wall, which again won't work because it turns out planes can fly over walls, and a lot of people who are here in an undocumented capacity came legally through visas and like flew on a plane, but whatever. Or if you see that video of that little girl scaling the wall, that's a whole other thing. But anyway, so military style tactics and equipment result in immigrants undertaking more dangerous, isolated routes to cross over, where the risk of death, dehydration, and assault are exponentially higher. So this is something that was done on purpose in the 1990s to try to, quote, get people, discourage them from coming to the US, but without actually dealing with any of the economic or social problems that are coming from a lot of these interventions that our government has made in a lot of these countries and into their economies and politics. Then we are getting the backlash of our intervention, but we're not really taking account for that and not helping people that really often are trying just to escape violence. There's even vigilante groups that take it upon themselves to, quote, protect the border, right? Like the Minutemen. Ugh. So at the same time enforcement is harshened, social services for immigrant families has also been slashed. So even though a lot of research has shown that immigrants commit far less crimes than the native-born population, the social rhetoric is that we're being invaded, right? To quote the president. So this is extremely problematic when you talk about the issues that children face as immigrants, especially in the modern day now, in past when this article was written about what's going on with forced family separation. Even though courts have deemed it illegal, it's still happening. There's still many children that were not placed back with their parents because they just lost them in the system. Literally thousands of children that are still in our system in some sort of foster care somewhere, but can't actually be accounted for. So it's a horrible situation when you have, little kids living in their own filth in detention centers, being forced to take care of other smaller children. So you have like 8 or 9-year-olds taking care of babies, covered in filth. And as you saw in some of the detention centers that the Democratic, presidential nominees, the people that want to get nominated, that they went to the border and saw some of these facilities where children were denied soap, toothpaste, toothbrushes, things like essential needs, blankets, things of this nature. And this is also another problem when you talk about the kind of international aspect of domestic labor, sweatshops, and the sex trade. So meaning that a lot of immigration is still predicated on the financial interests of that immigration. So there's plenty of people that are undocumented in this country because they were either trafficked in, right, through, now they're stuck in domestic labor, often in wealthy neighborhoods like Brentwood. And actually there's a really interesting piece that came out, I believe, in the LA Times, talking about how while the fires were raging and everyone was being evacuated from places like Brentwood, that the domestic workers, the people who were also doing a lot of services for rich people were still expected to go to work, right? Not to mention the fact that a lot of people work in sweatshop labor here in the US, right? Like in the garment district. I put a little video here to include to give you more information, though I want to include it in this audio, but every time I do something like that, stupid YouTube takes it down as copyright infringement. So anywho, I just put that link there and you're welcome to watch it. But really, there's a lot of, kind of ways that we should be focusing on the damages that some of this trafficking does to the victims of this trafficking. Instead of just making people's presence illegal, what we should be doing is criminalizing the financial gain of exploiting immigrants, bodies and movement. Okay, so moving beyond analysis. Basically, the article talks about how what we really need is movements, right? So one example of this is the Committee on Women, Population, and the Environment. And they argue that the oppression of women, not their reproductive capacities, need to be eliminated, right? So they call for drug treatment for women with drug and alcohol issues, for decent jobs, for educational opportunities, for mental health treatment and access that's actually affordable, for childcare services that people can afford. Because a lack of all of these services denies someone their dignity and also exacerbates all the conditions of poverty, right? It leads to a poorer social status, which, is often also commingled in, discrimination. So I put some of the information here from the actual committee, their website, and their kind of mission statement here, that they seek to foster a dialogue that builds collaborations between social movements to move beyond single issue identity-based politics towards an inclusive, I should say an inclusive, but whatever, political agenda across progressive movements. So another one I included as well, just because I think it also is very important, is the understandings that came from the Occupy movement, right? So they really focused on the concepts of inequality, the 99% and the 1%. So really understanding that, and now this is a mainstream thing that we all know, right? That there's a small proportion of people in our country that have, just a handful of people have more wealth than the bottom 50% of the entire population. So really, when we can galvanize around these issues, what's fascinating about Occupy was it united people that were, unions, environmentalists, feminists, all of these different groups that were all kind of dealing with their own single issue identity politics or dealing with their own issues of capitalism, and realizing when we unite together, whether it's about immigration or any of these things, that there's so many more ways that we're overlapping and related, and that we need to struggle for each other's struggles, not just for our personal own, right? And so one example of this that they kind of moved on was Occupy Our Homes, which I thought was fascinating. Basically, it was this thing where they would go, right during the recession when people were getting, basically taken out of their homes because they couldn't pay anymore and they're being foreclosed on. What they started doing was camping out at people's houses and basically making it so that they could go to work, they could leave their house, and they wouldn't get everything like locked up and taken away, by literally creating encampments in front of the houses and demanding that the banks renegotiate the terms of the mortgage with the family so they can stay in their home, because that's been shown to not just be better financially for the bank and for the community, but of course for the family. When you're paying on a payment for a house that's worth $300,000, but the payment is, based on the worth being $500,000, like clearly that's unfair. The market dropped out. So why were people still paying the same as they were when their house was more valuable? So Occupy Our Homes was kind of a practical way of taking the values of the Occupy movement and putting it into action, right? And then of course there's others, right, that are more modern from when this was written. You have the Black Lives Matter movement, right, that's really focusing on police brutality, issues of killing of unarmed men and women of color, in kind of routine traffic stops, or just in these like insane, like the Atiana Jefferson one, where just even playing video games with your nephew at home, right, you can be at risk. And really another example of this too that also came out of the recent time period would be the Me Too movement, or even what's called Time's Up in Hollywood, right, focusing on issues of sexual assault, believing women, right, and all of these people coming forward to take down these huge predators that have been basically operating with impunity for over 30 years. You have people like, Roger Ailes at Fox News, Bill O'Reilly. You have, what's his face, the Harvey Weinstein, and all of these, Matt Lauer, all of these creeps that, Bill Cosby, that for years were able to get away with it. Not just because, all the people around them were offending, but those people protected them, even though they knew what was happening, right? So by kind of creating these movements, but also seeing the commonality of our interests, meaning there's obviously an overlap of Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, right? Seeing race and gender as a thing where you can't say it's exclusive, right? Meaning there's plenty of people in the Black Lives Matter movement that are women, right? And there's plenty of women who have experienced, sexual assault, rape, harassment, that are also women of color. Like, we have to see the overlapping things, and we have to see the ways that even if we aren't personally that particular identity, that we need to coalesce together to fight these injustices as a whole, right? Instead of just kind of slicing up only our own identities as politics.